As the House January 6th Select Committee moves forward with its investigation into the causes of the insurrection, Republicans are trying to pull a Jedi mind trick and just make everyone forget about everything they said and did leading up to that day. Last week, in response to the House Select Committee requesting telecom companies preserve the phone records of a group of Republican lawmakers, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy threatened those telecom companies not to comply, saying a future Republican majority would punish them. This week, during an appearance on a local news program in his home district, McCarthy tried to scrub the record clean for Donald Trump.
Another question that the Democrats want to know is how deeply was the president involved?
Well, you know what's interesting about that? That's where law enforcement goes. Right? The FBI has investigated this. The Senate had bipartisan committees and come back. And you know what they have found? That there's no involvement. But this is purely political, and how Nancy Pelosi has handled this.
Huh. That's interesting. It seems like McCarthy is basing that claim, oh, this is interesting. Guess what? Nothing to see here. Off this Reuters report that cites 4 anonymous current and former law enforcement officials. But the January 6th committee's chairman, Democrat Benny Thompson, vice chair Republican Liz Cheney, shot that down, saying, quote, when this anonymous report was first published, the Select Committee queried the executive branch agencies and congressional committees involved in the investigation. We've received answers and briefings from the relevant entities, and it's been made clear to us that reports of such a conclusion are baseless. We will continue to pursue all elements of this investigation in a nonpartisan and thorough manner. Our investigation is likely to have something to show this week. 2 weeks ago, that was when the January 6th committee demanded records from 8 federal agencies relating to the attack involving or related to more than 30 people, including Rudy Giuliani, Mark Meadows, Trump's chief of staff, Trump's 3 eldest children, Ivanka Trump, Eric Trump, and Donald Trump Jr., First Lady Melania Trump, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, and former White House chief strategist Steve Bannon. Chairman Thompson set a deadline of September 9th for the records, and that is this Thursday. Aswin Subsang is a senior political reporter for the Daily Beast, the author of Sinking in the Swamp, How Trump's Minions and Misfits Poisoned Washington, and he joins me now. Swin, let's first start on that document request. This is different than the telecom companies, obviously, because it's from federal agencies, and those federal agencies are in a position to furnish this stuff. So this is not something we anticipate, I think, to get hung up in court. What is your understanding?
Well, my understanding is that for the past several weeks, Trump has been huddling with close advisors and attorneys, trying to game plan different ways to address these different requests. And as you mentioned, there are different facets to this investigation when it comes to documents or phone records requests, to try to see which elements he will be able to try to stall the investigation, if not completely hobble it, probably not completely hobble it, by invoking executive privilege. That may sound weird to some of your viewers because Donald J. Trump is obviously no longer a leader of the free world, but it's something he and his lawyers have actively been discussing behind the scenes to try to use to make sort of an argument about not just his presidency, but all future presidencies, I guess, including Joe Biden's. And the funny thing is, when you talk to people who've spoken to Trump about this in recent weeks or even days, they will tell you that one of the people he brings up most frequently when he talks about the executive privilege arguments is former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. And he gets in a little bit of a tizzy about why any White House Chief of Staff should have to be subjected to this quote unquote harassment.
Kevin McCarthy's answer on the local news program was interesting, and I thought the response from Thompson and Cheney was also interesting. You had a great piece about just sort of recalling a thing that had sort of vanished down the memory hole, which is that McCarthy himself and other Republicans had called for some kind of inquiry into January 6th. And so you sort of followed up on that and found that basically there's no, I mean, not surprising, no appetite for that anymore.
Chris, would it shock your audience that this maybe wasn't the most good faith declaration of investigative intention? This was a situation where back in July, Kevin McCarthy said in response to the moves that Nancy Pelosi's and others were making, that Republicans would mount their own sort of counter investigation to trot out a counter narrative about what happened in the lead up and during the January 6th pro-Trump riot on Capitol Hill. So obviously, time has passed, months have passed. We followed up with various sources around Capitol Hill and elsewhere in the senior ranks of the Republican Party to ask if there's been any movement on this whatsoever. We couldn't could find barely a shred of evidence. In fact, probably less than that there actually is movement on it. It's something that even Donald Trump has moved on from and doesn't care about anymore. This was almost certainly, unless something dramatically changes, another, hey, look at this shiny object over here attempted a trick that the Republican Party has been doing basically ever since January 7th.
There's also that letter from House Republicans to the telecom companies. And that's going to be, that's very interesting, partly because Kevin McCarthy is subject. It appears his records, a part of that records request, that could be a big kind of showdown. There might be legal implications. A bunch of House Republicans writing to them, including writing to Marissa Mayer, who was left Yahoo like 4 years ago as the current CEO. So I'm not sure who is doing the staff work there. Not a great look. To basically make real the kind of threats that McCarthy and others have been offering.
Right. And it goes to show the amount of care and the level of seriousness that they are approaching the actual legal or constitutional issues that come with a big investigation and congressional probe like this. And look, it's yet another example of how, especially during the Donald Trump era and after it, that Republicans have largely disposed with this idea of leaving big business alone and having this sort of small government conservatism that was barely hanging by a sinew before Donald Trump came along as leader of the free world. But it's something that they completely tore the mask off during the Trump presidency, where every nightmare they have about a socialist or far left Democrat getting into the White House or taking the reins in Washington, D.C. and cracking down on big business, they are doing exactly that so they can protect their dear leader, the former Celebrity Apprentice host, Donald Trump.
I will carry my firearm in D.C. and in Congress. This caused outrage from Democrats and the media. Why? It's our job in Congress to defend your rights, including your Second Amendment. And that's exactly what I'm here to do.
That is Congressman Lauren Boebert. She is super into guns. It is hard to believe she has only been in Congress for 8 months, sworn into her first term representing Colorado's 3rd district just this past January. Boebert won a Republican primary, riding the wave of controversy she generated when the gun-themed restaurant she owned defied local COVID orders and continued to operate despite a cease and desist order from the county sheriff's office. In that short 8 months, Congresswoman Boebert has reliably generated outrage with her trollish Trumpian style of politics, like when she clashed with Capitol Security over metal detectors after pledging to bring her gun to the House floor, as you just heard. Or when she tweeted, "Today is 1776," on the morning of January 6th, just hours before the violent insurrection. Or when she showed up for a Zoom congressional hearing with just a whole mess of unsecured guns piled up on the shelf behind her. Or just last week, when she announced she has a plan to remove President Joe Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi from office. So that is Congresswoman Laura Boebert, the kind of MAGA Republican from a safely deep red district who could devote herself to this kind of weird performative politics, whose number one policy idea is like, I'm going to carry my gun into the House floor without ever really worrying about a competitive race. Except Colorado, which Boebert represents, is currently redrawing its political maps. In fact, all 50 states are. This is what it looks like now. This is what it could like in the future, reshaping the entire western half of the state, which geographically speaking is currently almost all Boebert's district. Now, while this new map is still a work in progress, right now it looks as though it's possible Boebert's district could be merged with the one represented by none other than Congressman Joe Neguse, the liberal Democrat who rose to prominence as one of the impeachment managers during Donald Trump's second impeachment trial. Again, nothing set in stone. The map could change again, or Boebert could decide to run a different, more favorable district. Right now, though, Congressman Neguse seems to believe that there is a credible chance Boebert could be his opponent for re-election next year. Congressman Joe Neguse currently represents Colorado's 2nd congressional district, and he joins me now. First of all, what is your, I'm always fascinated by how members of Congress get their information about the redistricting, because obviously it's massively important and consequential for you. What is your understanding of where things stand and how possible it would be that you would square off with Congresswoman Boebert?
Well, good evening, Chris. It's good to be with you. I found out the same way that members of the public did when the map was released by the commission late last week on Friday evening. As you said, of course, the maps could change, and I suspect are likely to change. The commission is an independent commission here in Colorado. We're working, as you know, to try to emulate actually the independent style of redistricting that we have here in Colorado at the national federal level through H.R. 1 and other pieces of legislation that we've worked on. So time will tell ultimately as to what the final map looks like. Obviously, we'll be prepared for any eventuality and any outcome. Of course, this particular campaign, to the extent that the map lines were finalized in that fashion, would be an interesting one. As you astutely described, our worldviews couldn't be more different. And obviously, we have a very different view as to governing and how to ultimately represent our respective constituents. So would make for an interesting campaign.
Well, I want to talk about that in a second, but you mentioned the independent commission. There's something really interesting happening this time around in redistricting. So some states like Colorado have an independent commission. There are other states, Virginia and Oregon. And as the Colorado Sun pointed this out, in Democratic-controlled Colorado, Virginia, and Oregon, new congressional maps drawn by commissions or bipartisan power-sharing agreements are unlikely to give the party the sort of political advantages it could have otherwise enjoyed. Meanwhile, Republicans haven't given up their power, controlling the process in 20 states, including Florida, Texas, and North Carolina. And so I think you and I both agree that as a policy matter, these independent commissions are much better than politicians picking their voters. But there's a weird kind of unilateral disarmament that's happened here where you've got states like yours that are quite Democratic and quite Democratic controlled doing that while the Republicans can just maximize the number of seats they put together.
Well, I take your point. I mean, obviously, I agree with you that extreme and partisan gerrymandering has become insidious and pervasive across the country, and in particular, Republican-governed states, right, largely, in states like Texas and Florida, where clearly you have legislatures that will work to corrupt the redistricting process. But I don't believe that that fact ultimately, compels or would warrant Democrats doing the same. Far from it. I think, as you said, as a policy matter, Democrats believe in good government. We believe in ethics in government, and that means independent, nonpartisan redistricting, which, as you know, Chris, is wildly popular on a bipartisan basis across the political spectrum. In Colorado, as you mentioned, this is a relatively new style of redistricting. It was approved by the voters themselves just 3 years ago by an overwhelming basis. And I think that the voters made the right call. Politicians shouldn't be in charge of drawing district lines. That job should ultimately be one handled by a nonpartisan commission like the one in Colorado. So if anything, I think it underscores, Chris, the real necessity for us to get serious in Washington about recognizing gerrymandering really is another form of voter suppression, and why H.R. 4 and H.R. 1 ultimately need to get across the finish line to the president's desk, because many of these states, as you know, have already embarked on their redistricting processes.
Yeah, H.R. 1 would sort of create this process across the country. Last point, just to bring it back. I mean, to me, what this example shows is how powerful it is when you can control the lines, because you could sit down and draw a map that puts you and Congresswoman BOEBERT into the same district where she would trounce you. You could do one that you would trounce her. Like, regardless of worldview or your abilities as members of Congress or whatever, like there's a certain degree to which drawing the maps is quite determinative of outcomes. Not 100%, but pretty far. And you can really see it when you think through these kind of thought experiments.
Yeah, look, I mean, again, I think it's the reason why the nonpartisan independent redistricting commissions and reapportionment commissions in terms of state legislative maps are the way to go. At the end of the day, the voters should be in charge, and by extension, the citizen-based commission that we have in Colorado and that we also have in many other states across the country. And I think politicians, candidates ultimately need to be comfortable with letting the chips fall where they may. And so I'm certainly supportive of the measures that we've taken here in Colorado, and I hope that the Congress will get the message in doing the same in Washington.
Well, if you open up a diner in Boulder where everyone has to pack, I guess we'll know what's going on, Congressman.
Gravity to it that was stunning. Andy stepped back, and I caught his eye. We had heard there had been a plane crash, and I made the sign of an airplane with my hand. Andy Card nodded and put up 2 fingers. That was the confirmation that this wasn't some tragic accident. It strikes me that looking back 20 years later, what we know now is what the president knew at that moment, and we did not. The president had already asked the intelligence community, what could al-Qaeda do to hurt Americans on U.S. soil? And that whisper was his answer.
When did the magnitude of the moment really hit you?
Actually, at the school, those of us traveling with the president, and even the president himself, knew so much less than everybody else in the country. We weren't by a television set watching the first plane and watching the second plane. So I figured it was bad when the president stood up, said, "Excuse me." He went into the other room. We were rushed out of the school classroom, just the small travel pool that was in the back of the classroom, rushed out the door into a school parking lot.
At what point did it really hit you as far as taking your reporter hat off and the implications of this as a citizen?
I don't think there was ever a moment when the emotional side, the personal fear side of this ever hit. Even when we raced off to the airport, boarded Air Force One, and as soon as we got on Air Force One, we learned the Pentagon had been hit. So we knew we weren't going back to Washington. I wasn't scared for us in the plane. I wasn't afraid for the president's safety. I was appalled and shocked and heartbroken for the people on the ground.
And then take us back to the first time you get on the air with Peter Jennings and you have just a few facts and there's so much chaos.
The only way I could file my pool reports to the rest of the White House press corps in Florida and to the world was to call into ABC News, where they patched me immediately through to Peter Jennings live on the air.
President Bush is here at the home of the Strategic Command.
And I'm talking into a little Motorola clamshell flip phone, but it had pretty good signal. All I could tell Peter Jennings and the world was that the president said this was a apparent terrorist attack. He was returning to Washington. But I also knew that the Secret Service takes any threat anywhere and assumes it is a diversionary tactic, and the real target is the president of the United States. So at that moment, my job was to say, the president's safe, he's on move, he's going to be on the airplane, and we have no idea where we're going.
And what was that like for you, boarding Air Force One, and then you're just flying, you don't know where?
There was a sense of this was the fog of war. In this case, the fog was as thick as that smoke billowing through lower Manhattan by that point. We knew there were attacks on the building. We heard that the Pentagon was in flames. The fear was, how broad did this go? The enormity of it was absolutely lost on us, because on Air Force One, the only information we had as we flew for hours was a hazy picture on the television screens that are embedded in the front bulkhead wall of each cabin on Air Force One. And the president, in his cabin up forward, was furious and frustrated. He had 3 secure phone lines, and the higher we flew for safety, the more of those lines deteriorated. One of the most telling quotes from the president came as we arrived back to Washington about 7 o'clock at night, and the president looked out the window of Marine One at the burning Pentagon, and he told the person next to him, "This is what war looks like